Hello, good evening and welcome to another program on Law and Order. Today, like every week, we'll touch upon an area that is important to you. Now, you know, we all get involved in one way or the other with banking. Whether we have opened a small savings account or whether we take a major borrowing for our business or one way or the other. But do we know exactly what is this banking law and why the banks does allow us to do some things, but some things they are not allowing us to do, and why do they take security, and so many questions. Well, we know we cannot finish this in one program, but we will try to do as much as possible to bring to you knowledge about the banking law of Sri Lanka. And to do that, today we have an expert guest as always. My expert guest is Mr. Sirikumara Kudagama. He is the Additional Director Legal and Compliance of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Sirikumara, thank you very much for taking time off your busy schedule and on coming to Law and Order. How are you today?
Fine, great.
Great, right. You just told me that you had nearly a 2-decade experience in the banking industry. To start off this discussion, just tell me, I know this is a very broad question, but what would be your answer when I ask you the question, what is the banking law of Sri Lanka?
Yes, Chanakya, thank you. To start with, the banking law in Sri Lanka is basically shaped according to the English law. As you are aware, the civil law ordinance introduced English law into certain areas of business, including banking. So banking law in Sri Lanka is basically based on English law. English law on banking has been introduced by courts, the common law as well as statutes. And the common law position in banking is somewhat very old, and probably we see certain things as very archaic, for the reason that the English common law understood banking law, especially the relationship between bank and customer, as something similar to the relationship between debtor and creditor. The description was banker-customer relationship is a contractual relationship where the relationship is akin to that of the debtor and creditor, where the bank is the debtor and customer is the creditor. You know that when we are doing banking transactions, basically, we keep our money with the bank. So we are the people who are giving money, in that sense we are the creditors, and banks are the people who are borrowing money from customers, they are the debtors. Now that is the traditional approach in English common law, which has been adopted in Sri Lanka as well. But going ahead, this traditional approach would mean that customers are exposed to so many risks. Especially if you look at certain judgments in English law in the 19th century and so on, what they say is that once you part with your money, when you give your money to a bank, that money becomes the bank's money and it's no longer your money. Bank is known to use that money for whatever the way that they think good. So even if the bank puts your money into jeopardy, that's okay. That's what the traditional banking law says. Yeah. But you know that that is not the case in any country as of today. Now in Sri Lanka, this traditional banking law background, common law background, has been used to build upon that, and there are a lot of regulatory laws and regulatory directions and so on, which should protect bankers for the sake of the depositors and other customers of banks. Right. So it's a extension of traditional banking law, traditional English law. That extension is basically a statutory law, that is statutes enacted by the Parliament of Sri Lanka.
Right. What are these statutes that are enacted by the Parliament?
Basically, you know that Central Bank of Sri Lanka started its operations in 1950. It was established in 1950. At the inception, the Monetary Law Act, which is the statute that established the central bank, had several provisions on banking and bank supervision. Especially John Exeter, who was the first governor of the central bank and the architect of central bank here, introduced certain things like Section 29 onwards of the Monetary Act introduces banking supervision. Banking institutions are supposed to be under continuous supervision by the central bank. Now this bank supervision department has been established in the central bank from 1950. It is one of the key departments established in 1950. And the Director Bank Supervision, who is the head of that department, is the authority in this regard. He has the authority to look into documents and records of banks and get them to give information and things like that, through which he continue with continuous supervision of banks. Now this supervision has so many connotations for different people, but it's with certain things in mind that central banks and financial regulators are doing financial supervision everywhere in the world.
Right. Now, there are state banks in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
And there are private banks in Sri Lanka.
Yes.
What would be the common acts? Is the law defined, or if I were to explain my question, the acts or the laws enacted by the parliaments, are they all common and same to the private banks as well as if the state 3 or 4 banks, or are they different? If so, what is the reason?
Yes, about this classification of banks, I mean, I take a slightly different approach.
Definitely.
And in Sri in Sri Lanka, banks are broadly divided in 2 categories.
Right.
One is licensed commercial banks, and the other one is licensed specialized banks. The Banking Act, which was enacted in 1988, is the statute that governs both these categories, licensed commercial banks as well as licensed specialized banks. Commercial banks are the entities which do what we call banking business, which is defined in the Banking Act.
Right.
If I am to take the very common feature, general feature, very prominent feature of commercial banking, that is an institution maintaining demand deposits.
Right.
In other words, current accounts. Those are the entities that are doing commercial banking. On the other hand, from 1995, we have another category called licensed specialized banks. They don't maintain current accounts, but they do have savings accounts and other forms of accounts. They do so many other things that are done in commercial banks, but the salient feature, the absent factor is they don't have current accounts. So we call them licensed specialized banks. So any bank operating in Sri Lanka would be falling within one of these 2 categories. You asked me the question about state banks and private banks.
Yeah.
Now, that is a question about the ownership of these institutions.
Right.
So one entity may be owned by government, another entity may be owned by the private sector.
Right.
But this entity owned by the government may be a commercial bank or a specialized bank. And similarly, in the private sector, certain banks are commercial banks, certain banks are specialized banks. Now, the difference here is that certain things are statutory organizations. Government sector banks. There are statutes enacted by the parliament by which these entities have been created. On the other hand, commercial banks operating in the private sector and other banks operating in the private sector are companies. That is the form. But when you look at the business that they carry on, it is either licensed commercial banking or licensed specialized banking.
The difference between these 2 you explained.
Yeah.
Then there's another category of institutions called the financial institutions. Are they coming under the banking law, or is it a different law?
These are finance companies.
Finance companies, yes.
Those are not coming under the banking law.
Yes.
They are governed under the Finance Business Act of 2011. That is a different area from commercial banking and specialized banking.
Right. Before I go to the role that you all play as a central bank and all that, do you think, now you would have followed the laws in Sri Lanka, the way banks operate in Sri Lanka, is it healthy, is it good enough, I would say, for the future development of Sri Lanka in an open market economy? Is there changes that you feel need to be done to broad? Because I'm asking you this question for one reason. Most of the time, I have found foreign investors saying our banking operates in a very narrow-minded way. Is this statement true because of the existing law, or what is your taking?
Well, Charak, if you look at the development in banking in Sri Lanka, we developed from very small scale to kind of a very sophisticated and very vibrant banking system as of today.
Right.
Now, most of these developments have took place during last 20, 30, 40 years period. And nowadays, rather than thinking about locally established banks and things like that, a banking business, like any other developed industry, has become global.
Right.
I mean, you can't say that we are domestic, we are local, and therefore our
You can't survive
limits
like
are there. You can't survive like
Yes.
that. So I mean, we are happy that almost all the banks are going ahead with so much of technological developments, so much of other developments, product development, everything is there in Sri Lanka as well. But as you know, as in any other economy, there may be problematic areas as well. But we are happy that Sri Lankan banking sector is very vibrant.
Right. What is the role you all play? I know you have several divisions in the central bank. Central bank plays with regard to banking industry in Sri Lanka. What is the role you all play?
Yes. Now, Chanaka, to answer your question, I would say that banking, this particular banking is a business, as you know.
Business. Yeah.
So businesses are basically businesses may thrive or they may go into difficulties. But banking, we consider it as a different and some sort of a special area.
Yeah.
The particular difference here is that unlike in any other business form, when you operate a bank, you are running with a lot of other people's money.
Yes.
If you are running some other business, working in some other industry, probably your money and some borrowed money.
Yes, yeah.
But in banking, if you look at the contribution by the owners, that is shareholders or equity holders, contribution by depositors is huge. It may be something like 20 times the contribution by shareholders. So it's inherently kind of a fragile industry. You need to take care of the banking industry with utmost care. Now, that is the role expected of a financial sector regulator, I mean, the central bank here in Sri Lanka. Now, these entities are running with, you know that, as I told you earlier, that bankers are traditionally defined as debtors borrowing from creditors who are depositors. Now, when they borrow money, if the customer asks for that money again, they need to pay it back immediately. They can't postpone. But on the other hand, banks are investing their money by way of loans and other things, but they can't recover those things immediately. But in any country, if all the depositors of a particular banking institution comes to that bank and asks for their deposits,
I was about to ask that question. Yes.
Certainly,
Yes.
that bank can't survive.
Yeah.
But it is the duty of the regulator to ensure that that kind of things are not happening. Regulator's presence is there to ensure that rather than the ownership, I mean owners of the entity, there are large number of stakeholders who are having their hard-earned money with these institutions. Now, if I am to take an example, this fragile nature has caused difficulties elsewhere. Now, if you take the global financial crisis scenario several years ago, many institutions failed, probably due to internal mismanagement issues and probably due to wider macro issues in the society. Whatever reasons, institutions may fail in certain areas. But the regulator is there to look into this possibility and introduce corrective actions, preventive actions on a continuing basis so that you can create a safe and stable banking environment in the country. That is one of the prime objectives of the central bank as well, which is financial system stability in the country.
Okay. So that is basically, you would say, the rationale for regulation.
Yes.
Or is there more to it?
More in the sense, when you go ahead, you come across so many different things. Like when time goes on, you see that products are not the same. I mean, the technology is not the same. All these things expose banking sector to certain risks. It is vulnerable to all these things. So the regulator has to come up with this kind of things and ensure that the banking sector, the system is clear. And on the, one thing I must add is that banking institutions are having what we call is the domino effect or the systemic impact.
Right.
The failure of a banking institution may trigger failure of several institutions or probably the entire economy of a country. That we have seen evidence elsewhere. Now, the regulator of a financial system, banking system, has to ensure that that kind of institutions are protected with utmost care. So, that is the need for the presence for a financial sector regulator, especially a bank.
15 years ago, there were particular bank which fell. And it has happened in Sri Lanka. Some finance institutions, like you said, also fell. Now, despite regulation and stringent procedures, what would you see, although it's not a regular occurrence in Sri Lanka, that once in a while some bank were to, or some finance institution were to, fail? What triggers this kind of thing? What causes this kind of situation?
Now, this has a connection to what I just mentioned about systemic impact.
Right.
Now, certain institutions are huge and has a significant systemic impact.
Right.
If you fail, there may be a likelihood of so many others failing. But in a system, you need to take a very practical approach. Now, if you look at the financial system in Sri Lanka, if you take assets in the entire financial system in the country, banking sector basically accounts for the huge majority of the financial system assets. And there may be certain institutions, certain other sectors having lesser contribution into the financial system assets in the country. Now, certain institutions that have failed, recently we had a particular case where we calculated the value, that is, it was about 0.03% of the financial system assets.
Right.
But the thing is that when something like that happens, everyone remembers that. No, central banker's job is a thankless job. No one says that central bank is doing a great job at any time. But when a tiny institution fails, everyone starts complaining. I mean, from their point of view, that is reasonable. But central bank needs to look at more systemic institutions with utmost care and at the same time to ensure that consumer protection is also there. So it is one other aspect of financial sector regulation to see that consumer protection is achieved. There are a lot of mechanisms to ensure that as well.
Right. Now, in the US, and it hit Europe also, there was a thing called credit crunch. About 8 years ago or 10 years ago it happened. Now, even that time, we didn't feel it here. Now, what, I know this is not about Sri Lankan law, what triggered out such a thing in economy? Because what are the media reports we have heard about is that the loans they give, they don't take a security as much as stringent as us. Is this the only thing, or is there other economic situations that created credit crunch, which led a lot of US banks in the 2008-9 period and some European banks to face that? And I will couple another question. We didn't face it during that time. But could Sri Lanka also face a similar situation at one point or the other?
Chanaka, I'm not an expert in that particular area of finance, but I would say that in many countries this kind of experiences were there due to several reasons. Probably macroeconomic reasons in the entire economy that would be reflected in the banking system, which is a very fragile industry, and probably due to mismanagement in certain institutions. There may be numerous reasons for each case. But the situation now is that in anywhere in the world, everyone seems to have learned good lessons from this crisis.
Right.
Now, everyone is going towards a particular kind of a unique goal. That is to ensure that the banks are sufficiently capitalized. As I mentioned earlier, compared to capital, deposits are huge in a banking institution. So you need to ensure that enough capital is there in case there is something going wrong. And also that credit operations of a bank are done in a very safe way. Now you accept the securities, collaterals when you give loans, and collaterals should be of good value. And when you do credit operations, you must be careful about giving loans to unnecessary people. You must be very careful about giving loans to connected parties, related parties as you call it here. Now, those things are very common concerns everywhere in the world. Rather than looking at that, analyzing the past position, that those incidents, I would say that everyone is very forward-looking to see that all these, the lessons learned in the crisis period should not be repeated once again.
Right. What are the key things? Now, banker is known to be the person who gives the umbrella when it is shining and takes it away when it is raining. Just, this is
that's a common belief.
What is the? I know this is a broad question, but if you can sum it up for me in 2 minutes, can you tell me what is the thing a person should know when he is taking credit from a bank, whether it's a loan, a general thing, a massive credit card, or a business loan, or a housing loan, or something, what should a person be aware as a citizen?
Yes, once again, consumer protection comes in here. Now, there may be certain institutions willing to give loans, but as a consumer, as a customer, customers also need to be very diligent. in his operations. So, similarly, as much as a bank is supposed to be very careful in lending, we need to be very careful in borrowing.
Yeah.
Now, if it is not suitable to your profile, it's not suitable to your income, it's not suitable to your living standards and things like that, you must be very careful in enjoying that kind of facilities extended by the financial institutions. But at the same time, I must say that banks have a very good discipline that they would not normally extend an unnecessary facility to a person who is not suitable to kind of enjoy that kind of facility.
Okay, Mr. Sirikumara, thank you very much for joining Law and Order today, and thank you for those very vibrant and insightful thoughts about the broad aspect of the banking law of Sri Lanka. And we wish to see you once again as we go further and discuss in other areas of law.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. That's Law and Order for you today. We'll join you next week at the same time for another program on Law and Order. If you miss our programs, or if you want to watch our programs again, you can go to our website channeli.lk and go to the drop down menu and pick Law and Order, and you can watch our shows all over again once again. Have a good night. Enjoy the rest of the programming on Channel I. I'll see you next time.